Hello, my name is Michael Sliwa, and today I'm going to be discussing three different current events articles related to Eastern Europe, specifically things that could do with countries that were previously part of the Soviet Union in the past and kind of disbanded since then. Before getting into my actual video itself, I thought it would be a good idea to go ahead and show my Works Cited page, which is on the screen right now. I will also include a Word or PDF document with this in it as well, so that if you want to check out any of these sources, you can go ahead and just click on the link or highlight it, and you don't have to type it in by hand. So the first article I'm going to be discussing today is entitled East European Designers Sashay Onto the Catwalks of High Fashion, and this was published in Reuters. So basically this article talks about a Hungarian fashion brand called Nanushka, which basically is starting to kind of break into a international market, which is something that's really kind of unheard of as far as, this area of the world goes. It's cited as being an upstart designer from Central Europe, and it's really kind of elbowing its way into global fashion, and it's doing this through showcasing, collections on catwalks such as in places like Paris, New York, London, and they're targeting really big fashion markets such as the United States and China as well. And basically, this article goes into their whole story of reaching this point of, globalization and branching out. And while at first they were kind of like this struggling local brand, which is kind of what the article is saying, they kind of branched out from there, and now they make over, like $38 million or 33 million euros, depending on, the conversion factor. But, this kind of came up about relatively the past 5 years, which is, a really big branch into the globalization of Eastern European fashion and culture just in general. And even on top of this, it's becoming one of Europe's fastest growing fashion companies, and it's in the top 1,000 list of their highest growth companies in general, just in Europe, which is pretty amazing considering the fact that, as we kind of talked about in class, most of the time in this area of the world, fashion wasn't something that was prioritized. And I'll get like kind of back into that in a little bit, but I do want to keep going down and talking more about this article. So while Nanushka isn't the only fashion brand, there are other brands doing this as well. Most of the ways that these fashion brands are actually reaching out is through social media, which is something that's obviously relatively very new. And this is helping with globalization of this culture in general. So a lot of them have this niche in, creating high fashion awareness in Facebook and Instagram, along with other online platforms, which is allowing them to reach a variety of audiences, but mostly the younger audience. So even Nanushka's chief executive himself actually was talking about this, and to quote him directly, he said, "Without social media, probably 15 to 20 years ago, it would have been almost impossible to build a global fashion house from Budapest." And his point is very valid and true because, as we've seen in class, even in the past and reaching up more into the present times, it's really hard for that culture to diffuse out of Eastern Europe, and also a lot of that has to do with the fact that the world is a lot more globalized and connected, especially through social media nowadays as well. And it even says in the article itself that following the fall of communism in 1989, the fact that, like Western luxury brands and fashion houses were able to set up and produce all different types of, clothing things such as like bags, scarves, clothes just in general in that region. And that allows it to, kind of capitalize on that proximity to the European fashion industry, which, would have to do more with, London and like Paris and France and, places like that that are really, highly popular for their fashion in general, already on a global scale and for a long time. So I guess in a way, through globalizing their own fashion and also being exposed to the fashions of other nations, they're able to expand their horizons and also, kind of branch out. And this is really like one of the first times in history that Eastern European countries are able to do this, as I forementioned a little bit ago. This even branches out into countries like Poland, where Polish influencers are promoting this, Hungarian brand of, I guess, different fashion items. And, it's really helping also establish this global name that's really well known in, I guess, the fashion sphere, according to this article. But those are actually some of the main points that this article goes into. It talks a little bit more about, them desiring to have authenticity and stay true to culture, which is amazing to see that a company is able to stay so close to culture and so close to authenticity while also bringing it to the global market and being extremely successful. As I mentioned before, I mean, they have huge sales. And, again, this has really never been seen before. But kind of getting into some connections to our readings, we could talk about How We Survived Communism and Even Laughed by Draculic, where she talks about things like, Vogue and other fashion related things being a very distant concept in the Soviet Union. Like Russia and the Soviet Union in general wasn't really interested in wasteful things like fashion, and they, wanted this image of really strong women that would be hard workers akin to men. And of course, we talked about this as well in the Messina reading. We saw figures in propaganda, such as Mina the tractor driver, who were prevalent in really spreading that idea that, women could do the same things that men could do, and even more with raising children and other responsibilities such as that. I feel like that's a really recurring theme in this whole entire, class, and just talking about communism in general, is the importance that women played in kind of helping build those Soviet regimes and the Soviet nation in general. But kind of going back to the whole thing about Vogue and, fashion being distant, it was basically unheard of to get things from, very high fashion areas such as, we'll talk about like Italy or France or somewhere in that area, where fashion was even prevalent back then. It was kind of a dream to get those kinds of items over in the Soviet Union, and something that wasn't really possible. We also talked about how foreign goods were pretty much, like a very rare commodity as well. And the fact that, there were homemade remedies for making makeup and other things to try to emulate that whole, fashion scene. But a lot of the time it was, just kind of homebrew stuff and not really commercial types of things. And again, they wouldn't be produced in the Soviet Union anyway, because they were looking to be optimized. And, basically you produce this one thing, everybody gets the same thing. You don't have all these choices of like makeup and all of those kinds of things you would see in a capitalist nation. Another kind of funny but really relevant example that we also saw in class was the Wendy's Communist Fashion Show commercial, in which pretty much every woman that came up was wearing basically the same drab clothing. And, it kind of was poking fun at the fact that there wasn't a choice in the Soviet Union, that women really didn't have fashion and things of that nature, and that whole culture of like very high-end fashion or just fashion in general hadn't diffused into Soviet nations for a very long time. And now we're starting to see not only the fashion diffuse into the formerly Soviet like nations and things like that, but we're also seeing it diffuse out and being very successful, which again was completely unheard of. So I would say that this article, talking about this event really marks a big milestone for a lot of these formerly Soviet nations, and it's kind of showing how they're finally really, really getting close to becoming completely globalized and interconnected with a lot of the big nations, like I mentioned before, like the United States and China. So kind of moving into the second article here, which is entitled "Russia to Host International Talks with Taliban as Putin Looks for Gains in U.S. Absence" by the Washington Post. We're kind of getting into more international relations between, Russia, the Middle East, and the United States in general. So as we've seen recently, the U.S. has withdrawn from, areas of the Middle East such as Afghanistan, where Taliban rule is really big and prevalent. And this has kind of put, Russia in a bit of a weird situation, because obviously they don't really want to mess with the United States. But now that the United States isn't in that situation, they kind of see a bit of an opportunity for them to, kind of start influencing and reasserting their influence in the Middle East, while also, distancing from like the Afghan struggles themselves, poverty, war, the Taliban kind of being like a dictator at this point and kind of forcing themselves into the entire government of this nation. But, also with the Soviet Union, or not the Soviet Union, I guess Russia, formerly Soviet, but Russia trying to kind of stick their hand in there and see what they could get out of the situation. So in a sense, Russia just kind of wants to use Afghanistan without really getting involved in its people or any of its struggles going on. They kind of just want to expand, which is something that we've seen in the past as well. And again, we'll get into that more in the connection to the classwork section of this video. But yeah, this was publicized really by Andrei Sarenko, who is a head of the Moscow-based Center of Contemporary Afghan Studies. And, I guess he would be kind of like an authority on talking about this, and he would understand how these foreign relations kind of play out. And really, Afghanistan itself really isn't the interest here. It's just the fact that, hey, here's a bunch of land, there's some conflict going on, we can kind of stick our hands into here and see what we could do, especially because the US is out of it, and now, there won't be any interference from another global power. But even Vladimir Putin is kind of saying at this point that there really shouldn't be a hurry to recognize the Taliban's rule. I think he's kind of thinking at this point, like, let's try to ignore these people who are problematic or going to cause problems, and, just kind of take that and run with it and try to, see how much we could influence this region, because it's in such a state of turmoil and, just war in general. In a way, the Taliban is also kind of trying to race against, Russia and other countries in Eastern Europe to try to grab some of that, that fresh, I guess, control that, is really easy to grab because of, just the disorder of everything. And, Taliban leaders in the past few months have visited a handful of countries in an effort to kind of do this and gain international recognition of their efforts and, do the same thing, expand out. So while Russia is trying to expand its ideals, even in the current day, and it did, kind of the same thing in the past, the Taliban is trying to copy that and also go against it and spread their ideals and kind of be recognized more on this international level. So while the U.S. has kind of talked to the Taliban, about certain things and tried to work with them, I think in the, the main scheme of things, this relation is really just going to be beneficial to the Taliban. And the article also goes into that a little bit, talking about how, if the Taliban is able to grab some support from the US, even for a temporary amount of time, they can directly combat, Russia's efforts because, throughout history, the US and Russia have kind of been at odds with each other. So they've kind of decided, okay, we have to kind of go against Russia. So let's just team up with the US, who's, already kind of against Russia and not exactly, their greatest ally and things like that. And we could kind of, gain extra power through that. So, in a kind of event called the Moscow Talks that's going to be occurring soon or may have already occurred, I'm not really sure, from how this article is written, but like nations like China, Pakistan, India, Iran are going to be attending and kind of discussing what should be done about Afghanistan and, what is the correct thing to do in their eyes. And something that's important and significant about this is that the United States is, invited, but they're not going to be attending. So this kind of shows, I think the desire of the United States as well to kind of remove themselves from that situation, which, may be kind of a detriment to the potential ideas that the Taliban is having of teaming up with the US, in a very, loose sense. But I guess the positive that's coming out of this, and again, it might be a self-serving agenda, is the fact that Russia, China, and Pakistan are planning on having some sort of joint interest in providing, some sort of humanitarian and economic assistance for Afghanistan during this time. And we've kind of seen a very similar thing in the past, which I could actually just go ahead and dive into right now, which is what happened with the whole veiling situation in Uzbekistan that was covered in the Northrop reading, where women who, previously had no issue with veiling, it was kind of a tradition, customary, had nothing to do with patriarchy, were suddenly told that it was a bad thing and that they should like stop doing it. And a lot of them actually did. So, Russia kind of saw a weak point in this area of the world. And they were like, okay, we're going to go ahead and come in and say, hey, this thing that you're doing is wrong. Try to empower your woman. And, this would, of course, help them to push their ideals and, further communism and push women's rights, which again, as I mentioned recently, would help them to push, the ideals that, like women should work, they should help, and it would get more laborers into the entire mix. So since I've already kind of jumped into that, I guess that I pretty much summarized the article and talked about some of the, different things going on, along with throwing in my own opinion on the entire matter. But some other things, that I kind of talked about had to do with things like Russians' foreign affairs, which, during the Cold War, the US and Russia were kind of at odds with each other. And even in the current day, they kind of are. And like I said, this is kind of assisting the Taliban in trying to resist this Russian influence that's trying to come in and take over this very vulnerable area. And as I mentioned before, Russia's tried to diffuse into other countries various times. That's how communism kind of spread and the Soviet Union grew, is by just kind of engulfing these different countries, sometimes against their will, sometimes just kind of through propaganda and other things like that, without really even saying anything, just kind of moving in, saying, here's how it's going to be, and just having power over those nations. So, this really isn't a new thing. It isn't, very uncharacteristic of Russia and, back in what it was the Soviet Union, trying to reach their hands into different foreign affairs that might be of benefit to them because, those areas might be weaker than they are, in principle. But getting back into the whole thing about being anti-US, in the past, we viewed a lot of things in class that would, kind of support this. The one that we viewed that I found the funniest was the Wendy's commercial, but along with that, we also viewed President Reagan's, communist jokes that he made very often, which although he had good relations with Russia at the time, obviously poked fun at their system and way of living and showed that he wasn't exactly for it. Another thing we talked about in class was your story about, the VHS incident and how some of your colleagues were taken out of the country or went missing because they were watching a VHS, and the KGB wasn't so happy with that. And when they discovered it, they thought that it had something to do with the United States or some kind of, anti-communism movement or anti-Russia movement. So, they got in big trouble for that, it seemed. And kind of wrapping up with the Cold War, which I think is a very, interesting thing that we could look again at, U.S. and Russian relations. There was a Red Scare and anti-communist feelings in the U.S., along with Russia pushing all this propaganda talking about how bad capitalism was, and and they kind of knew that it would tear down communism, so they kind of isolated it, not allowing things like, as I just mentioned, like Vogue, foreign products, like things like Coca-Cola, things of that nature, different foreign candies. Like, it was all very much, we produce it here in Russia or in the Soviet Union at that time. It's our things. We don't really want these outside influences. What we give you to buy is what you buy, and that's pretty much the end of it. There's no choice like in capitalism. But I think that pretty much wraps up all I wanted to say about my second article. So we're going to go ahead and move into the third and final article, which is a bit more talking about, current relations. And again, like, there's a lot of the same themes that go along with it, but I'll go ahead and begin talking about that. So the title of this third article is China-Lithuania Rift is a wake-up call for Europe. China is bullying Lithuania. The EU and NATO should push back. And this was published on Foreign Policy, which it seems is just a news source that will talk about, relations between different countries, which is great because that's exactly kind of what I wanted to talk about in relations to types of articles when I was looking for them and things like that. Before I get into this article, I also thought it would be important to mention an article that I read on the New York Times while I was looking for, these main three articles I wanted to discuss. And that article basically talked about how Russia was withdrawing from NATO, which is a big deal because, NATO, or the National Atlantic Treaty Organization, was something that was basically a military alliance between 28 European countries and 2 North American countries. And in withdrawing from such a big military alliance, it kind of shows their sentiment in saying that, they're not exactly on the same page as a lot of these other nations, and that they have some sort of alternate, I guess, plan that goes against that. And I guess, a lot of countries have withdrawn from NATO several times. It's not like a very rare thing, I would say, but it does kind of mark when big events are going to happen, especially those related to, militant types of activities. So I guess this would also kind of point to the fact that, as I was saying in the second article, the fact that Russia is kind of planning on doing some sort of, not exactly invasion, but I guess it would be like a cultural invasion or an ideological invasion of Afghanistan while it's in a very dire and vulnerable state. But anyway, getting back into this article, basically what it's talking about is the fact that, China's kind of trying to muscle Lithuania into, I guess, kind of following its ideologies. But I guess this needs a little bit of background, which I'll quickly discuss. So basically, the 3 nations involved in this whole conflict are Lithuania, China, and Taiwan. And the issue comes in with Lithuania kind of acknowledging Taiwan as a separate entity and also having foreign relations with Taiwan, which China doesn't like, because China's whole thing with Taiwan is the fact that it doesn't exist. It's not a separate thing, and it's just part of China. And there's no distinction between China and Taiwan. If you said, hey, this island over here is Taiwan, they would be like, no, it's China. And they're very, very serious about that. And they've pushed this ideal onto their people through various different tactics. But, the general consensus is that Taiwan doesn't exist. It's just, part of China. So this issue by the article itself is, kind of twofold. The first kind of, aspect of this, where the entire conflict started, is the fact that, Lithuania authorized Taiwan to open a representative office in Vilnius. I think I got the pronunciation right on that. And it would be called the Taiwanese Representative Office in Lithuania, and they would also have a reciprocal office in Taipei by the end of the year. And really, China's big, stick with this is the fact that using the word Taiwanese in the name of the office in Lithuania was a big deal because, hey, Taiwan doesn't exist. What are you saying Taiwanese for? This is, China, it's part of China. There shouldn't be any distinction. But where the issue comes in with this is the fact that the policy that Europe and the United States follow, called the One China policy, basically saying, that Taiwan isn't separate, isn't really contradicted by the use of Taiwanese in the name. And really, under that, China shouldn't be getting mad about this. They should just kind of allow it and, just let it slip through and not cause a big deal. But that's, kind of the opposite. They're really causing a big deal about this. And they're trying to, coerce Lithuania into changing their views and, not acknowledging this nation that's a very real thing. Taiwan is completely different from China in several senses. So as I said, this is kind of a two-part thing, and this gets into another aspect of this entire, issue that Lithuania and China are having in terms of Taiwan, and it has to do with an agreement that was made between Lithuania and China to like withdraw from a 17+1 cooperation agreement between, the two countries and nations that basically allowed China to invest in infrastructure in the region, like mostly Central and Eastern European countries, but that would include Lithuania. But, right, like they're not really withdrawing. They're kind of at a standstill and they're kind of refusing to withdraw their efforts. And the reason this is a big issue is because China is really using this to maximize its diplomatic influence, which is really a bad thing because it's spreading communism again, which, is something that we partially said, was a bad thing when it came to the Soviet Union. And we're kind of seeing very similar things with communist China trying to push its ideals onto Lithuania and, use it to kind of influence it to help their own efforts with, taking none of Lithuania's own opinion into account. So it's kind of a big mess. There's a lot of things going on here, and hopefully I covered them pretty decently. I think that the general two ideas are A, Lithuania acknowledges Taiwan and they want to be, cooperative with them, and China doesn't like that. And along with that, the fact that, Lithuania kind of wants to cut some ties with China and that China doesn't want to cut just yet. And it's using its size and power to kind of keep those things intact when Lithuania is like, hey, we don't really want you to be involved with us anymore. And this has led to some big retaliation over in Beijing, which has, recalled a lot of its ambassadors from Vilnius, in Lithuania, along with limiting trade through suspending rail services between the two countries. And, China is a huge manufacturer of several different goods. So when you cut off China, or well, I guess when China cuts itself off from your country, it's a really big deal. And I mean, a lot of countries, especially countries the size of Lithuania, should probably start to like kind of panic because they need a lot of things from China. And it kind of puts them in this really weird and I guess a situation where they're being, overtaken by the power of China because really, from the relation, Lithuania loses a lot more from not having relations from China than China would lose if it had to withdraw from Lithuania. So hopefully that makes sense. But really, the whole thing is just, trying to break and sever some of the agreements that they had or some of the relations they had while trying to keep some of the other essential ones. But of course, China has really the power position in this situation. And that's causing a big, international issue where potentially NATO and other organizations may want to step in because, the clauses of those agreements are kind of being broken. And of course, while this connects to Eastern Europe, this is more focusing on like Central Asia. Like China obviously is the biggest nation in Central Asia and one that is currently communist, which again ties back into, the fact that Lithuania, formerly communist, now is really not because it left the Soviet Union disbanded, all of those things. But China is still over here, holding those same values that people don't want to really return to. And also, since this is more of an argumentative article, something that the author of the article itself says is directly quoted, it's time for the transatlantic partners to respond with a policy akin to NATO's Article 5 Common Defense Commitment. And, this is basically coercion against one is coercion against all. Since China is trying to elbow in, and try to do a lot of negative things in Lithuania, other nations should come in and say, hey, that's not right, and try to muscle them out of there and kind of mediate between these two countries and nations as they're going through this. And of course, there are more, things related to this that we really wouldn't cover as much in class, like economics and different things like that. But I think basically I've gone over the main meat that this article is trying to communicate. So I'm going to go ahead and move into some analysis here. So something that we kind of saw, throughout time is the fact that Central Asia was really highly influenced by communism through its proximity to the Soviet Union. And while the Soviet Union at this point has disbanded, a lot of those communist regimes and ideals have still remained in Central Asia, especially China. And, that comes up a lot in the news, very recently, and is still, even in this article, a very relevant thing. We also have this idea of isolationism and, kind of getting our hands into a nation that might be problematic while also not being completely involved in it. And that's kind of what China's doing with Taiwan. So Taiwan is kind of problematic to China in the sense that it wants to be independent and a separate nation, but China doesn't really want that. So instead of completely separating it and acknowledging it as a separate nation and an enemy, it basically says, hey, you're not a separate nation, you're just part of us. And, whether you like it or not, we're not going to acknowledge the fact that you are a separate nation and that you have a different government and a different economy and basically a different everything. That same parallel can be made to, a lot of these countries that the Soviet Union ended up engulfing, like I mentioned earlier, the whole thing with the veiling in Hungary and how, a lot of these people had this tradition that they wanted to stick to, and all of a sudden the Soviet Union kind of comes there. They're like, hey, we don't like this. We kind of like you, but, this whole veiling thing is problematic to our whole regime of trying to get women more involved in our country and in our nation. So, let's cut that out and, just get rid of it entirely. And the same sentiment can also be seen in, compared between Taiwan and China and also the US and the Soviet Union in a kind of similar way, in the sense that, China and the Soviet Union had obviously a very socialist type of government, while Taiwan and while the US is more capitalist and Taiwan is more of a free market economy, which, there can be some similarities between those as well. We'll kind of generalize them together and say that they're more the opposite of socialism. Obviously, the difference in economy and opinion on how an economy should be run in the nation has also caused some of these conflicts. So that's kind of another thing that ties into this whole situation. So in the way that the Soviet Union stifled efforts of, wanting foreign things, wanting, a more capitalist type of economy, and also, some people wanting to have relations with the US, they kind of stifled that, just in the way that China is stifling its people from being like, hey, we should be nice to Taiwan and kind of acknowledge them and things like that. And they really, go against that idea and basically teach history in a way that's different, to say like, hey, Taiwan is not this separate thing, it doesn't exist, blah blah blah, we've gone over this. The Chinese government also functions, currently very similarly, but with more technology, in comparison to like the Soviet government back in the day. And you can kind of make connections between the KGB and, I guess there would be a Chinese equivalent that the article didn't really talk about, but that could be assumed because people in China also, when they speak out against the government, do go missing. And, that's another problem. But, this whole connection can also be drawn. So basically, silencing opinion that goes against the regime, making sure that people are all on the same page, and basically not caring about cultural aspects in different countries and different nations, and kind of trying to assimilate them into one common ideal with the rest of the countries, in that regime. But I think that pretty much covers everything I wanted to discuss. I hope this wasn't too messy or too hard to follow. But a lot of the main points in these articles really connect back to our classwork, and I found them really interesting, to be honest, especially in relation to more of the Asian discussion, because I've heard a lot about China and Taiwan and things of that nature, and really didn't have the time to look into it. But I kind of made the time to do a little bit of research and find out more about it for this video.